Use this deployment as a means by which to push the Iranians towards negotiations.
Ayatollah Khamenei tweeted almost every day, "Death to Israel."
Whom should we surrender to? Iran is not a nation to surrender.
You don't know. I may do it. I may not do it. I mean, nobody knows what I'm going to do.
Now, Donald Trump will decide on whether the United States will join the Iran-Israel conflict in the next 2 weeks.
Well, White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt has read out a message from Trump after what she called a lot of speculation about if the U.S. would be directly involved in the conflict.
Now, she said, quoting Trump, that the decision will be made within the next 2 weeks, as there is still a substantial chance of talks to end the conflict.
Regarding the ongoing situation in Iran, I know there has been a lot of speculation amongst all of you in the media regarding the president's decision-making and whether or not the United States will be directly involved. In light of that news, I have a message directly from the president, and I quote, "Based on the fact that there's a substantial chance of negotiations that may or may not take place with Iran in the near future, I will make my decision whether or not to go within the next 2 weeks."
A senior intelligence source and a Defense Department official cited by CBS said the U.S. president has approved attack plans on Iran but has not made a final decision on whether to strike the country and formally join Israel's air campaign.
Now, this report said that Trump has been briefed on both the risks and the benefits of bombing Iran's Fordo nuclear facility. And he believes that he doesn't have much choice. Finishing the job means destroying Fordo, he said. Fordo is the heart of the Iranian nuclear program, built deep inside a mountain and protected by strong air defenses. It houses uranium enriched up to 60%, just below the level needed to make a nuclear bomb.
Now, The Guardian on Wednesday claimed that the U.S. military has reservations regarding the success of using a bunker-busted bomb to eliminate Fordo. Now, two defense officials were reportedly briefed that only a tactical nuclear weapon could reach the facility. However, it was reported that Trump is not considering using a tactical nuke.
However, on Thursday, Fox News senior White House correspondent Joachim Heinrich reported that he was told otherwise. He said top officials told him that none of the options are off the table, and the U.S. military is very confident that bunker busters could get the job done at Fordo.
And for more on this, our correspondent Susan Tehrani has sent us this report from New York. Take a look.
As tensions in the Middle East climb, the White House is walking a tightrope between pressure and restraint. President Donald Trump has seemingly paused any immediate strike against Iran, saying that he will decide within 2 weeks whether or not to intervene in the Israel-Iran escalation. That would be until about July 3rd. He emphasized diplomacy, notably the upcoming talks in Europe, while also maintaining that military options are open, reaffirming that a nuclear-capable Iran is unacceptable. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt echoed those comments, saying that President Trump prefers diplomacy, but also insists that Iran must end uranium enrichment. Any future deals, she stressed, must eliminate enrichment entirely. So for now, Washington is holding back. But Trump's demand for unconditional surrender from Tehran signals that this pause may be short-lived. Meanwhile, the United Nations Security Council is expected to hold an emergency meeting on Friday regarding the Israel-Iran conflict here in New York. Susan Tehrani reporting from New York for WION World is One.
All right, for more on this, we're now being joined live by Lieutenant Colonel Daniel L. Davis. He's a military expert and host of Daniel Davis Deep Dive on YouTube. Thank you so much for joining us on World Day again. Always a pleasure to have you. And I just want to begin by asking, what is your assessment of where things stand in West Asia at the moment and the United States' involvement in this?
Well, it's really anybody's guess. Trump said it best himself. I don't know what I'm going to do. I don't know that anybody knows, because on the 1 minute it looked like we were really getting close to an attack. I had heard from several sources that claimed to have access to some of the senior government officials in Washington. They thought that there would be an American attack before the end of the weekend. They thought it was something close to a sure deal, and then Trump upended that earlier today by saying, no, how about 2 more weeks later from now? So the big question is, though, why this delay? Is that because he's genuinely going to give diplomacy a chance and wants to give one more shot at it? Or is it because, which is certainly plausible, that the military moves were not yet ready, that they needed to move some more folks out, possibly out of the Qatar air base that you mentioned a minute ago? Some of the troops in Syria have been redeploying and getting out. It could be that they're trying to make us less vulnerable before we go into attack, or it could be diplomacy. No one knows for sure which it is, but all options are on the table, as they say.
Right, so and having said that, we know that as America's closest ally, Britain is almost certain to be affected in more ways than one. And now if Donald Trump does decide to get involved, and overtly this time, what role could the UK play coming in the escalation, how it's going forward, and what role would the UK be playing in it?
Well, that's uncertain, because there's a number of things they could do. Air power seems to be the biggest and the most likely case. That's what happened. I believe it was in the April of 2024, the first time Iran used missiles and drones to attack into to Israel in response to the attack where Israel destroyed the embassy in Syria. So it could be something like that. It could also be some naval power. Definitely could be intelligence capabilities. So all kinds of situations and possibilities. The big question, though, for the UK they've got to ask is, what is in their national interest, and is it useful to go into something that, and certainly many analysts, I'm definitely one of them, think that this is a no-win situation. Going into Iran now could expand the war, could make more people join into it, certainly draw the United States in. There's plenty of bases that we have in the Middle East. You can redeploy some folks, but you certainly can't get rid of all of them. We got bases all over the place, and all of them would be at risk. And of course, if Britain joins in, they would also be at risk. And it seems pretty likely that Iran would take some British assets under fire if they came in. So everybody has to calculate, is it worth going into to try and take out an Iranian nuclear facility, especially the one at Fordo, if it may not even be succeeded, but in fact gets you killed in the process and get your country into a war? That's something I think has not been given enough thought to.
Right now, Mr. Davis, I also wanted to ask you, we are seeing somewhat a shift in position. Netanyahu has been saying that this is also for the Iranian people. It's an opportunity for them. He said this recently, that they oppressed them for 46 years. They've yearned for freedom. 80% of the people would throw these theological thugs out. Then we also said Putin say that Israeli strikes have actually led to a consolidation of Iranian society around its leadership. And now we're hearing that Netanyahu is saying that actually regime change was never the goal to begin with. This is an existential war for us, and it's the nuclear threat. And what actually happens in Iran is up to the Iranian people. So how do you assess this back and forth? Or is it that perhaps Netanyahu has some assessment of the fact that that's not how it's going to work?
Well, I think it's more the practical aspect of, because it was earlier today, this very day, when an apartment, a hospital was hit in Israel, and he stood before everybody and said that the leader of Iran must die. He cannot continue to live. And so that seemed to be pretty much, yeah, we're going for regime change. And then, of course, as you pointed out, then there was some very mixed messages that came out later on to imply some different things. And listen, this comment about, you know, I'm talking to the Iranian people, and they may come up with some percentage that they're against the Iranian regime. Most of that is just misinformation and attempt to create human opinions that people can have both within Israel to bolster that, within the United States, within the Western world, and in a vain attempt to try and sway some people in Iran that I don't think anybody's buying it. There's no doubt that there are some people, a significant number, that do not like the regime and would love to see it go away. But from some that I've talked to, the idea that they want to basically help Netanyahu kill their way to it is not something that they're very keen on, because even though they don't like that regime, they certainly don't like the Israeli regime that's killing, in their view, the Palestinian people in large numbers, or now they're attacking Iran. So I don't think that's going to work very well for Israel.
Right, so, and Prime Minister Netanyahu has time and again and unequivocally said that the civilians will be held accountable for the actions of the government. And it has also said that we'll keep going on with the offensive for as long as it takes. Now the question is, what could the timeline be like, and for just how long can either side sustain this conflict? Let's start with Israel.
That's actually the great question, is how long can either one of them maintain this? And Israel is definitely not in a position to where it can just indefinitely go on, because, number one, it itself is very much limited on its own industrial capacity, its ability to create especially these high-tech interceptor missiles, the offensive missiles that go both from aircraft and from launchers. They're very limited in that. So there's already, in the Wall Street Journal yesterday was a report that Israel's already running low of interceptor missiles. The question is, how is Iran doing? How many long-range missiles do they have? I suspect, and from the best sources that I can consult, is that they have probably a significant number. And I think right now, based on the video evidence, they've been firing a lot of their older stuff first, because a lot of the warheads will disintegrate as they're coming in, which, by the way, even they're not being intercepted. And if Israel is reserving some portion of its best stuff, then that means they have more more punishment that they can mete out. And then the real question is, when will Iran then bring in their long-range drones, which they have tens of thousands of reportedly, and only a handful have been used so far. So it could be that they're trying to saturate the air with some of these expendable missiles to get rid of the interceptor missiles, and then when they get low, they can come in with the next round in multiple waves, which can suck down more. And if they get to a point to where even periodic, in local areas that the Israeli side runs out, then they're going to be very vulnerable in an area. So Israel is not in as strong a position as a lot of people think, and I think the military inside of Israel has to really take this into account before they decide just how far can they go.
Right, so, and then, of course, coming to Iran, and we know that it's hard to say for sure at this point, but what do you think is the strategy here, like with Israel and now with U.S. just 2 weeks away from joining in? Do you think the U.S. is just letting Israel batter Iran out to the point where it could be strong-armed into coming back to the negotiating table, but for a U.S. brokered peace this time and on U.S.'s terms? Does that seem to be the strategy at play here?
It certainly could be, and that's a plausible position to have, but it's also a risky one. Look, if you wanted a negotiated settlement, if the U.S. wanted one, there was one on the table before all of this explosions happened, before Israel launched its preemptive war, because the Iranian side said, yes, we're willing to have a negotiation. We'll consider nearly anything except the enrichment. We won't go to zero. And under international law, there's no one that can tell them they can't do that. They said that's a sovereign right, but they said we will give on other things. But then President Trump made that a red line and said, well, if you don't go to zero, then we're not going to have a deal. And of course, under international law, you can't go and attack a country just because they don't take the policy that you want them to on an area where there's an international treaty that allows them to have limited reprocessing. So we'll see if that's going to work. But then it's going to be a question of, Iran, for them to succeed, their big strategy is they just have to not be defeated. Whereas Israel has to have either a regime change or they have to knock out their nuclear facilities. If they don't do either of those, then it's a strategic loss for Israel, whereas Iran has to just hang on. So the standard for Iran to succeed is lower than the one that Israel has now set for itself.
Mr. Davis, I'm glad you mentioned that, because it actually now brings into question Israel's strategic objectives, or whether or not it's been able to achieve it, or whether or not it can achieve it at all. We were speaking to Professor James A. Russell earlier as well, who said that you cannot simply bomb Iran's nuclear program out of existence. And we do know, you're absolutely right, that there were negotiations on the table. They were having discussions. They might have been at an impasse, but Iran did make it clear that when it comes to the nuclear program, completely dismantling it, that would be a red line for them. Then we see Operation Rising Lion being launched. And if we were to talk about Netanyahu's comments about Iran being very close to having a nuclear warhead, these are comments we've been hearing perhaps every year since 1996, you know. And this really brings into question whether the red line defense model or the preemptive strikes defense model, that is something that we're seeing a complete breakdown of in West Asia.
Yeah, and listen, that's a great point you bring up. How can we all forget those many times when Netanyahu was at the UN Security Council General Assembly and he holds up that big picture of a bomb and said that, they're right up into the neck, they're almost going to get there, they're weeks away, and yet the weeks pass, the years pass, and they don't get one. And then now here again, after launching this and saying that we had to act now, he still says, well, it could have been a year or even more, but he said that's beside the point. No, that's not beside the point. That is the point. You say you don't want them to have a nuclear weapon, and yet they didn't have one by all accounts. They didn't have one. And so now then you have to get to what was really the objective. And that's why I say the evidence seems more likely that Israel wanted to have a regime change than they did actually to prevent a nuclear weapons breakout, which even the U.S. intelligence said was not on the table just as recently as March.
That's very interesting, because of course if the regime change was the goal, which it did appear to be for a long time until this latest statement came out, the next obvious question would have been, of course, what's the plan for the day after? And from the experts that we have spoken to about this as well, they didn't seem to have an answer for everyone that I asked as well. They said that, well, that's up to the Iranian people, and that's pretty much echoed in Netanyahu's recent statement as well. So that what you're saying does make sense there. Lieutenant Colonel Davis, thank you so much for joining us on World DNA. As you know, it's always a pleasure to have you on with us. Thank you so much.
And joining us on the broadcast is Giorgio Kefero. He's a professor at Georgetown University. He's also CEO at Gulf State Analytics. Mr. Giorgio, appreciate you joining us on the broadcast. First up, a very significant statement that's coming in from Marco Rubio, who says that United States would allow Iran to operate nuclear power plants but not enrich its own fuel. Your assessment of the statements coming in from the U.S.?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for having me on your program. Always honored to be your guest. I think what we're seeing right here is the United States doing everything it can to use military force to basically push the Iranians into surrendering their right to enrich uranium. This is obviously what Trump's goal is right now. I don't think anything that Marco Rubio just said is too surprising, but let's keep in mind that as a consequence of the Israeli and now American aggression against Iran, the Iranian leadership, I think we can expect them to move ahead toward becoming a nuclear armed state. So this is really, in my opinion, the greatest irony of all of this, is that for all the hype, all the exaggerations about Iran's nuclear threat, the way in which the U.S. has dealt with the situation is going to drive Iran towards having a nuclear bomb.
But Mr. Giorgio, differing statements coming in, convoluted in a sense, because on one hand, Donald Trump said that the nuclear sites have been completely obliterated, but the Pentagon says that these sites have been severely damaged. Your assessment, have the sites been obliterated or have they been damaged as of now?
My understanding is that the sites have been severely damaged, but not entirely obliterated. I also do think it's important to point out and remind all your viewers that Iran's nuclear program is not just simply these facilities. The Iranian nuclear program also is about thousands of Iranian nuclear scientists, and it's about knowledge that simply can't be bombed away. What has been damaged by the United States and Israel can, of course, be rebuilt. I think probably what we should maybe be concerned about is that we are now in a new era where it's just sort of increasingly normalized for the U.S. and Israel to bomb Iran. And there's going to maybe be a perception in Washington, at least among the hawks here in Washington, that there has to sort of be a mowing of the lawn foreign policy toward Iran, where every few months, every few years, the U.S. just bombs Iran's nuclear facilities to try to set the program back further and further with no real end game in mind.
Yes, so Mr. Giorgio, in continuation to that, Iran has warned of repercussion. There's going to be severe consequences is what Iran maintains. But there's not been any sort of a retaliation, any significant retaliation, so as to say. Do you see a calculated restraint on part of Iran, or do you see the groups backed by it, the Houthis or even the Hezbollah for that matter, getting activated in the region?
Yeah, great question. The ball is obviously in Tehran's court right now. The Iranian leadership will decide how to respond and also when to respond. The response might not necessarily come soon. I think Iran is going to have to very carefully weigh serious risks when deciding how to respond or how not to respond. Getting to your question about groups in the region that some people like to call the proxies of the Islamic Republic, when it comes to Lebanon's Hezbollah, I'm not sure what this group can do to make too much of a difference. Of course, as a consequence of the Lebanese organization's war with Israel last year in 2024, Hezbollah is much weaker today. When it comes to the Houthis in Yemen, I think that this group is now sort of vanguard of the axis of resistance, and the Houthi rebel movement in Yemen is probably Iran's most valuable ally in the Arab world at this point, and I certainly expect the Houthis to take some action at some point. But let's also keep in mind the Houthis, we should not look at them as an Iranian proxy. They have their own agency. They're going to make decisions about how to respond to recent developments on their own, definitely not taking orders from Tehran.
Also, Mr. Giorgio, if you can talk to us about what is the sentiment like back home in the U.S. We've seen the kind of dissent that is clearly brewing. How challenging is it going to be for Donald Trump to assuage the concerns back home over U.S. getting involved in the war against Iran?
Well, in Trump's Make America Great Again MAGA base, there's quite a bit of opposition to neoconservative foreign policy strategies. Neoconservative ideas. There is a lot of support from within his base for a more restrained foreign policy. We saw prominent members of this movement, whether we're talking about Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene or the very famous journalist Tucker Carlson, explaining that they're very opposed to the U.S. playing more of an overt role in the Israel-Iran war. And I think that this confrontation with Iran really stands to divide Trump's base rather significantly. Right. That being said, it will be important to see if these U.S. strikes on Iran were a one-off or if this is the beginning of a protracted military campaign against Iran
Yes, Mr. Georgiou.
Okay.
Right. That's exactly the point I was coming to. If you can talk to us, what are the immediate challenges for the US at this stage in West Asia? Because let's not forget the kind number of troops that US has deployed, at least 40,000 of them in West Asia, and of course its bases in Middle East.
Yeah, well, in the lead up to these American strikes on Iran, there was a lot of discussion about Iran possibly retaliating against U.S. military bases in the Gulf Cooperation Council states. Certainly, that's a concern that remains valid, but we should keep two things in mind is that, first of all, these strikes that just took place were not waged from any of those bases. And also, Iran has been spending the past few years improving its relationships with countries such as Saudi Arabia and the UAE, giving Tehran much incentive to not ruin the improved relationships with the Gulf Arab monarchies. So I think it's possible that the GCC states will not be targets of Iranian retaliation. That being said, there are also other countries in the region that Iran might see as facilitators or supporters of U.S. and Israeli aggression against Iran. So I would keep an eye out for what Tehran might do in relation to Syria and Jordan.
Yes, Mr. Georgiou, just last question before we let you go. What kind of response or assistance do you expect coming in from the allies of Iran, be it Russia or even China for that matter?
Well, I think Russia is going to support Iran, but with limits. I do not see Russia getting involved militarily, but I certainly could see Russia giving some support to the Iranian nuclear program. I think probably we could see Russia either officially or unofficially become supportive of Iran's move toward a nuclear weapon, obtaining a nuclear weapon. I think Russia will continue to put out very strong statements that condemn Washington and condemn Tel Aviv for their aggression against Iran. Maybe the Russians will provide Iran with some more weapons to help the Islamic Republic defend itself. But let's also keep in mind that Russia is very focused on the conflict in Ukraine, and also Russia has a relatively good relationship with Israel. And then thirdly, Russia and Iran have a very complicated relationship. So those three factors will probably lead to some serious limits on Moscow's support for Tehran right now. But as I said, I think there are going to be some forms of support that the Russians provide Iran. I'll add this as well. The Russian leadership has been upset with the Trump administration for not making more concessions on the Ukraine file. And I think Russia might try to leverage this confrontation between the U.S.-Israeli alliance and Iran in manners that can make the U.S. pay a price. So that will be important. It will be very important to see the Russia angle here.
Yes. Mr. Georgiou Kefero, we'll have to leave it at that. Appreciate you joining us on the broadcast.
Good to be with you. Thanks.
Hello and welcome to this edition of World at War. My name is Mohammed Saleh. Starting from the 15th of March, the United States has embarked on a relentless campaign of bombing the Houthis in Yemen, as the Houthis have disrupted commercial shipping in the Red Sea corridor in solidarity with the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. Weapons worth almost about $1 billion have been dropped on Yemen in a matter of days, with very little to show that the American bombardment has deterred the Houthis. Donald Trump had earlier claimed that he will end wars and not start a new one. But now he has posted a new video of the United States dropping a massive bomb on a group of people in Yemen with a claim that they are Houthis who had gathered for instructions for an attack. But the Houthis have responded by saying that what was bombed by the Americans was a traditional tribal gathering of civilians. The United States is also moving a second aircraft carrier, the USS Carl Vinson, to the Middle East. It is also increasing the presence of its B-2 stealth nuclear bombers at its military base in the Diego Garcia Island. And although the United States claims that it is hitting hard at the Houthis, many military analysts say that the real target of this military build-up by the United States is actually Iran. Our next report gets you the details. This chilling video, posted by Donald Trump, will give you a glimpse of what the United States is up to. Trump claims the Houthis will never again be able to sink American ships. Almost $1 billion worth of bombs have been dropped in Yemen in just the last 3 weeks. But to what extent has the United States been able to degrade the capabilities of the Houthis is hard to tell. But what is clear is that the United States, even under Donald Trump, who had claimed that he would end wars and not start a new one, is putting its men and military assets bang in the middle of a conflict in the Middle East to aid its close ally, Israel. On the 3rd of April, 5 people were killed, 5 others were wounded, and 1 was reported missing due to an American airstrike. The death toll in Yemen from the American bombings has now risen to 61, with 139 injured. Even water facilities have been very meticulously bombed.
We are now in the Mansouriya district of Hodeidah province. This is the site that was bombed the previous day. The entire water company, including the water plant and the building housing its management, has been destroyed. This was the only water supply facility in Mansouriya. The US and Israel bombing this place is an act of cowardice. This is a public service facility providing water to civilians. It supplies water to the people. Why did they do this?
But this appears to be just the beginning of this war. The United States is sending an additional carrier strike group led by USS Carl Vinson aircraft carrier to the Middle East. Besides this, satellite images have emerged of as many as 6 B-2 stealth nuclear bombers that have been moved in just the last week to the US-British military base on the Indian Ocean island of Diego Garcia. Diego Garcia is in the ideal position for the United States to target Iran, as America's Arab allies have declined the use of American military bases on their soil or their airspace to stage attacks against Iran. The B-2 stealth nuclear bomber is an interesting choice. It can carry America's heaviest bombs and also its nuclear bombs. This is hard nuclear saber rattling by the United States, which has been repeatedly threatening Iran over its nuclear program. But how is Iran responding to the American military build-up?
Nations around the world are angry and upset, and that's just based on what they know. There are many issues and atrocities nations around the world are not even aware of. The anti-Zionist regime and anti-US chants that you see in the streets of Europe and even the United States stems from their limited knowledge. They would do more if they knew more. All I'm saying is this rogue group must be eradicated from Palestine.
The United States has a total of 18 permanent and temporary military bases and over 40,000 of its soldiers stationed in the Middle East. Any attack by the Americans to destroy Iran's nuclear assets claims Tehran will put all American assets in the Middle East at risk. So the board has been laid out. The United States is moving its military assets into position. But the question is, will the United States, along with Israel, try and stage an attack on Iran's nuclear assets, sparking off a much larger regional war? In one of the most devastating attacks this year, at least 18 people were killed, including 9 children, and over 50 others sustained some grievous injuries in the Ukrainian city of Kryvyi Rih. Russia states that it attacked military personnel, but the Ukrainians have rubbished the Russian statement as misinformation, insisting that what was struck were residential buildings in the hometown of the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. Negotiations are underway behind the scenes to hammer out a compromise. Even Volodymyr Zelensky is now sounding optimistic, stating that a compromise could be struck within the next 1 month. But how close are we really to arriving at a negotiated settlement in Ukraine? Our next report gets you the details.
On the one hand, there are talks underway to end the Russian war in Ukraine. But on the other, Moscow has not stopped its relentless attacks on the Ukrainian front lines. This footage, released on the 2nd of April, will give you a glimpse of the scale of attacks that are still underway. Moscow now claims to have captured the Razlev settlement in the Donetsk region. A total of 142 targets were hit in Kharkiv, Zaporizhia, Kherson, and Donetsk. Russia claims all these were ammunition depots, weapons production sites, and temporary bases housing Ukrainian troops and foreign mercenaries. But on the ground in Ukraine, the emergency responders insist that even civilian and commercial infrastructure is being repeatedly hit.
The enemy conducted 15 strikes on 2 civilian enterprises in Kharkiv's Kholodonsky district. Fires erupted on 1,500 square meters. One of the fires is being put out. The enterprises were operational. They had regular day shifts. They were civilian enterprises. They produced sleds, polypropylene, and non-military products.
In principle, there's a moratorium on attacks on oil and power infrastructure. But that has not stopped the repeated missile and drone strikes on energy grids. The Russian Defense Ministry released this video of the American-manufactured HIMARS rockets, of which they claim they're being used by Ukraine to target the gas metering facility in Sudzha. Natural gas pipelines and power facilities in Bryansk, Tambov, and Lipetsk have been significantly damaged, causing disruptions in both gas and electricity supplies. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has called into question the moratorium if the clauses of the agreement to not strike at power infrastructure are not adhered to.